This is the Borderless Crypto Podcast. Hello there, this is George, and I'm excited to share that apart from my long-form interviews, I'm starting the Borderless Crypto Shots. These are select excerpts from my regular talks, which give you a concentrated chunk of information on a specific topic in just 5, 10, or 20 minutes at most. This crypto shot features Nathaniel Whittemore, the author of the popular crypto newsletter Long Reads Sunday. In the coming 20 minutes, Nathaniel and I cover what is narrative marketing, why crypto companies must employ it as a foundational layer of all their marketing and communication activities, what are some prime examples of crypto businesses utilizing narrative marketing, and how Nathaniel can help you build your company narrative. Please note that anything that I or my guests say in these talks is for informational purposes only and should not be treated as investment advice. And although during daylight I'm part of the team behind the crypto lending platform Nexo, at night, when I do these talks, I share only my personal thoughts, which in no way represent Nexo's opinions. Now it's time to get the podcast started in 3, 2, 1. Nathaniel, I first heard about the concept of narrative marketing from you. Can you share what is narrative marketing and how can companies, specifically companies in crypto, leverage it?
Sure. So for me, narrative marketing is just a way of looking at marketing and communications that recognizes that any conversation a company has, any piece of content that they produce, all of that is happening in a specific context. And that specific context is whatever set of beliefs people have about the market that the company is operating in. And these beliefs are narratives, right? And so when a company is trying to articulate, why it matters or why people should care, I think they need to have a sense of how their narratives and how the stories they want to tell about themselves and what they believe about the market interact with what people believe already. And so the interesting thing about marketing narratives is that the goal of understanding what market narratives your communications are interacting with is not to kind of quote unquote get it right in some way. And what I mean by that is that you can run into a market narrative or you can run completely against it and say, that market narrative is wrong and give people who don't necessarily buy into the dominant market narrative a different outlook. And either of those can be really good strategies. The only strategy that I think is dangerous is when people don't have any sense of how the story that they want to tell interacts with the market in general. So I guess maybe to give like a specific and very basic crypto example, a company, right now could decide to do an IEO as a really good way to engage a broader set of constituents and make the argument that the way that these exchanges are setting up terms actually makes it less likely for value to be captured by whales and more like you're going to get back to the original idea of token sales, which was to distribute and get a whole bunch of people in a network engaged and excited. Or a company could say IEOs are just ICOs 2.0. They're total BS. They're just another value capture mechanism for exchanges to kind of reinforce their power. And so we're going to take a firm stand against that. And I think either of those are viable strategies, but you kind of have to know at any given moment, which sides are going to attract which type of people and which of those conversations are kind of larger and more dominant in the mindset at the moment.
Which brings me to your next point, that narratives can be based on hard facts and data, but they're much more often actually driven by the gut.
Sure. Just taking that same idea of something like IEOs, people could point all day long to any fact that they want to support their position. So let's say that you're in, kind of pro IEO. You could say, well, look, there are caps on how much people can spend, and there are wider degree or wider array of people getting to participate. But ultimately, what people think about that is going to have much more to do with what their experience was with the ICO boom and what they think about that and what their feeling is about what just a force like exchange offerings have in the crypto industry as a whole. And those things, again, so they may be informed by data, but people who are against those things aren't making necessarily a data-driven argument that, here's the data that shows why these things are bad for the industry. They're going to make that argument on the basis of a set of theories and feelings about what they do and how they shape people's incentives and shift how people behave. So this is always the case with narratives in any industry context. They're always going to be driven by both gut sensibilities as well as by data. But I think that the earlier and younger your industry is, or the industry of focus is, the more likely to be shaped by the gut level sensibility those narratives are.
And why is that so? Why is it that narratives in nascent industries like crypto can have a much bigger impact than narratives in mature industries?
Kind of for that same reason, that in the absence of data, we have to have these guideposts to anchor us, and we kind of have to rely on narratives a little bit to do that. It's like a rudder for our behaviors and for our actions. And it's also an attempt, I think, a lot of these narratives are attempts at self-fulfilling prophecy, where people aren't just saying, hey, here's an explanation for what's going on. They're saying, here's what can, should, and will happen next. And by saying that and trying to get people to also believe it, it's almost like they're making an investment in that future and they're trying to get it to come to fruition. So, I think anchors function as sort of a rudder for the ship as we steer into kind of uncharted waters.
That makes total sense. And what is the connection between narrative marketing and other types of marketing, like SEO, social media, content marketing? Are they connected at all?
No, I think they're definitely connected. And then what it comes down to is the foundations that marketing is built on. So in some ways, narrative is about core underlying and foundational communications. Who are you as a company? What do you stand for? Why do you exist? Why did the people involved choose to focus on this project? And what are you hoping to create and change in the world? Once you answer those questions, you kind of have the elements of your narrative. And from there, you do lots of different types of actual marketing tasks, marketing tactics, marketing work to bring those to life, right? So that SEO strategy, again, what are the terms that you want to rank for? That could be just a purely, tactical assessment of what terms are available, but it's probably better if it relates to those core narratives that you want to do. I think content production, there's certainly a clear and obvious path between, what stories you want to tell, and then the content is how you tell them. So, for me, the idea of that narrative piece and really understanding your narrative as a company is about the foundations upon which, any and all other marketing strategies and tactics are going to be built upon.
I totally agree with you. But when you look at companies out there in the crypto space, do you think they understand narrative marketing and do they leverage it? Or do you think most companies disregard all of this and just do their traditional posts, emails, announcements without having this strong narrative foundation underlying everything that they do?
I think it's a narrative, and marketing is kind of a way of thinking and a way of looking at things. And what I mean by that is that I think that most good companies have some sense of who they are and what they want to stand for, right? I think the difference is that the narrative marketing approach is trying to be explicit about distilling that down into some core foundational pillars that from which you can build upon. And so I think if you look at different companies in the space, you can kind of see, who's indexing most strongly around, we stand for something and we're going to tell that story over and over again. So a good example is maybe like Casa, who really stands for the idea of Bitcoin and crypto more broadly as a force for self-sovereignty. I did a tweet a couple days ago asking what the best solutions were for someone who wants to put in a bunch of money to BTC, but who really doesn't want to do self-custody because they're worried or because they come from an old school or because they just don't understand technology that well necessarily. And Casa, their kind of social media arm, was very active and engaged in the conversation about not just saying, hey, you should really get them to self-custody, but offering ideas for how you make it more accessible, what they've set up to make this idea of self-sovereignty and self-custody more palatable for exactly this type of person. So I think that they're an example of someone who clearly has that root anchor in a core philosophy. And I guess I'll give you another example. I just saw yesterday, Preeti from True Story. So True Story, she was at Coinbase previously, and the idea of True Story originally was to kind of create an ecosystem where fake news could be combated effectively by allowing crowds to source information about, facts that were presented or, theories and opinions that were presented as facts. That was kind of the original idea, at least as it was presented in TechCrunch and a bunch of the early press that they got. But she just wrote this great thread yesterday about how what they're really trying to build, they figured out over the course of the first, year of their company, is a safe space for debate. That it's actually less about getting to the root of true facts and more creating a safe space for people to debate in a healthy way subjective opinions. And that's really the true story that they want to encourage is space where people can disagree without being disagreeable. And the way that she articulated this in a 15 tweet thread, I think shows a really strong, clear sense of narrative and where she wants to position and where the company fits in the larger context of fake news and social media and all this sort of stuff. And so I think, that's the type of content that really anchors a narrative that's going to allow for people to understand that company better, right? So if she hadn't done that, people would still engage with the company on the way that, maybe someone like TechCrunch had defined it when they wrote about it 6 months ago or a year ago. Because she's created that sort of foundational statement of this is our narrative, this is the context, this is what we're trying to do in that context. I think that she's likely to be that company is likely to be a lot more successful in communicating what they're about and getting people to engage with them, start on the right foot.
Absolutely. Now, aside from writing your long read Sunday Twitter threads, you're also consulting companies exactly on building their marketing narratives. Now, imagine you have a bunch of founders with quality projects sitting in front of you. How would you explain in short what you do and how they can work with you?
So there's almost two parts to your question. One is what I do with companies, and then two, how I help them construct narratives. And maybe I'll break them apart because I think the second one's probably more interesting for people than the first. So the way that I work with companies is basically two parts. One is I help them figure out their narratives and what they're going to stand for and how they communicate that. And then two, I help them bring that to life through content production. So that can be a lot of different things. I think I spend a lot of my time with writing and that piece of content production, but I also spend a lot of time thinking about multimedia and more kind of interesting, bigger form projects as well. But I think that maybe the more interesting question in some ways is how do you actually help a company figure out how to construct a narrative? And for me, it's really about, there's an intersection of two things. On the one hand, what I'm bringing with me is my observations of the industry dialogue as it happens, right? And so the Long Read Sunday thing that I do, which for any of your listeners who don't happen to know, is a weekly, basically direct to Twitter newsletter curation of 30 plus of the most interesting essays, threads, kind of much more on the opinion side than the news side, the interpretation and analysis side than the news side. And so I'm spending a lot of my time each and every week just seeing what people are talking about, how people are reacting to the news. So it's not just what's happening, but how people are interpreting what's happening and how it's influencing those overall market narratives. So I bring with me to any engagement this sense of how the market is thinking, feeling, and discussing key things happening. And then what I try to pull out of any company that I'm working with and those companies' leaders is their big whys, why they're doing what they're doing, why they chose to do this instead of other things, what they feel like other people who are kind of related to their project aren't getting right, or maybe just aren't seeing the world in the same way as them. And I think what we try to do is we try to find the intersection of those two things. So on the one hand, how the market thinks, feels, and discusses, and then on the other hand, how the company thinks, feels, and discusses. And from there, we kind of figure out like what that company wants to bring to the market, what they want to try to reinforce so those market narratives, what they want to try to challenge. And then it's just about figuring out how to turn that into great content.
How does it happen in practice? I just want to make it super practical for executives of companies who are listening to this. Can you walk me through this process? Is it an ongoing process? Is it a one-time process?
Yeah, sure. So it's usually the way that it is there's a one-time kind of foundational process that gets continuously refined over time. So when I first started an engagement with a company, we're going to really dig deep. I'm going to read everything that they've ever created. I'm going to talk to them and kind of a variety of people inside the company. I'm going to provide my feedback on where I feel like they're trying to differentiate and and that's not just necessarily what they're saying, but what I'm feeling, kind of the subtext of what I'm reading, the things that I kind of hear echoed over and over and over again that maybe they're not articulating yet, but seem to be coming through pretty strongly when we talk to them. So there's a lot of like learning that I do that then feeds back to them as I almost parrot back what I'm hearing, even if it's not exactly what they're saying. And that becomes the foundation for us, honing in on that key theme or that key set of themes that are going to define their narrative. So that's a process that happens, at the beginning of any engagement. So we're at least playing in the same ballpark. And from there, we kind of shift into content production mode. And that can either be in terms of collateral that needs to be updated because the website or materials aren't really articulating those narratives that we've determined are really at the core of that company. Or it can be in terms of, content that's trying to tell those narratives from kind of a story and a content perspective. And so the way that I think about it is that you want to use that first process to make sure you're speaking the same terms, that the company has maybe a better sense of itself. But then it's going to be refined through the actual content production, right? I mean, a lot of times you'll see something where, let's say that the key narrative theme is crypto as a force for liberty, or crypto as a force for self-sovereignty, or whatever it is. That's a good ballpark to start with. But then when we get into the actual content production, oftentimes you'll find there are refinements or there are specific sub-themes. And so I try to kind of move from at the high level and kind of subjective, helping people figure out what their narratives are, into turning those narratives into content pretty quickly, because where it really gets refined is the process of building and designing that content.
All right. That sounds like a lot of work to me. How many companies do you do this for?
It's constantly changing. I think one of the things for me or with this type of work is that, to the extent that there's ongoing relationships, it's much more around that content production. But a lot of times I'll work with companies and spend, a couple months with them really figuring out these narratives, but then moving, into content production mode. And we get to a point where they're ready to build out their marketing operations and have those full-time people and have, the full slate of marketers involved. So, my engagements can be short, they can be ongoing, but it's kind of constantly a moving target. And for me, the key thing is really just being able to bring this specialized, skill set and way of looking at things to the right companies who need it at any given time.
This was Crypto Shot number 1 with Nathaniel Whittemore. The best way to follow Nathaniel's work, which I absolutely recommend, or to hire him to help you with your company narrative, is by contacting him on Twitter. His handle is @NLW. Before you leave, I want to draw your attention to Nexo, without which this episode wouldn't be possible. If you're like me and you believe the long-term value of crypto will grow, then Nexo might be a useful tool for you. The company is the leading crypto lending provider, allowing you to get instant access to cash in 45 fiat currencies without selling your Bitcoin, Ether, or other crypto assets. You can use Nexo's loans to make new investments, to cover your personal, business expenses, or for anything else you like. Now, in case you don't need a cash loan, Nexo can also generate you passive income, up to 6.5% per year on your stablecoins or euro. What's more, interest is paid out daily, meaning you can add or withdraw funds at any time you like. You should know that the level of automation, convenience, and flexibility that Nexo provides are vastly superior to what any other similar service offers. This is the reason I myself joined the Nexo team. Having said that, none of this is investment advice. I just genuinely believe those services might be useful to you. You can explore more at nexo.io. Thanks for listening to this Crypto Shot. I'll talk to you soon again.